So I'm opening up the webinar. Procedural slides first. So, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the third meeting of the Martha's Vineyard Beach Road Study Working Group. Those of you who don't know me, my name is Patrick Snyder. I'm the MassDOT project manager for this effort, and I'm joined today by members of our consultant team and other staff at MassDOT. I would like to thank you all for joining us today and thank each of you working group members in attendance, including any elected officials or members of their staff on the call today. Today, we're meeting to discuss this conceptual planning study at Five Corners and Beach Road in Tisbury. This is an important intersection for connectivity in Tisbury and on Martha's Vineyard. We really appreciate your partnership throughout the study process, especially your patience as we've worked to determine future year flood models and develop alternatives. We start with Zoom procedures just so that we're all on the same page. Later in today's meeting, we'll have the opportunity for discussion with questions and comments later in the presentation. If you'd like to share comments or questions during the presentation, you can use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. There's a button to click down there that says Q&A. On the bottom left of your screen, you can use the buttons to edit your audio and video options. You will have the opportunity to speak verbally later in the meeting, at which time you can click the raise hand button or click Alt-Y. If you're on the phone, you can dial *9, which will raise your virtual hand, and we will see it on the screen. As always with technology, we do sometimes have audio or tech issues, so if anyone can't see the slides at any point or there's some audio cutting out, just feel free to jump in and let us know. If you are unable to access the internet or have technical problems today, you can call into the meeting on the phone at 1-312-626-6799 and enter the webinar ID number 892-6769-4663 and enter the passcode 516871. Those numbers are also in the confirmation email that Zoom sent you when you registered for the meeting. If you're watching today's meeting on a computer, you can use the view button at the top of your screen to adjust the view settings, gallery, speaker, etc. Closed captioning is available and it's automatically generated by Zoom. You can activate it by clicking the button at the bottom of your screen. It says CC Show Captions. If you have trouble with the general Zoom technology today, you can call 1-888-799-9666. And that will connect you to Zoom technical support. And just an overview of MassDOT meeting procedures before we launch into the presentation. This is an open virtual meeting today. Members of the public are welcome to attend. It's primarily a working group meeting, but there will be an opportunity for public comments later in today's meeting. It is being recorded. Massachusetts Department of Transportation may choose to retain and distribute the video, still images, audio, and/or chat transcripts from today's meeting. By continuing attendance, you are consenting to participate in a recorded event. If you're not comfortable being recorded today, you can stay on mute, camera off, or excuse yourself from today's meeting. The slides and recording for today's meeting will be posted online for viewing at a later date, so if you do excuse yourself, they will be there. We'd welcome all questions or comments today, but we ask that you please keep them respectful. We are interested in having a dialogue here, collaborating on solutions in this area, so just reinforce that. And to quickly run through today's agenda, we'll start with an overview of this study, just a refresher on why we're carrying it out and what the goals are shaping our study. We're going to continue with an initial review of flood vulnerability and the safety analysis, which we carried out as part of our foundational work. We'll then review our draft alternatives and present our analysis of potential impacts for them. Then we'll give an overview of recommended next steps, and there will be a discussion among members of the working group, followed with a public comment period for any members of the public in attendance who may wish to ask questions, give comments, feedback, etc. So proceeding to an overview of this study. These are the goals and objectives we established at the beginning of the study process when we kicked this study off. We aim to evaluate roadway improvements at Five Corners and Beach Road to increase safety and comfort for all road users, including vehicles, pedestrians, and bicycles. This will build on a road safety audit that was carried out previously and prior discussions about addressing operations at this intersection. It's a major intersection, and MassDOT recognizes it's quite important. We also aim to address current and potential future flooding. MassDOT, like I said, recognizes this is a key challenge at this intersection, and we want to collaborate with local stakeholders to address flood vulnerability and on decision-making in this area. Moving to the next slide. This map shows the extent of the boundaries of our study area. We recognize that there's some interplay outside these boundaries, but this is our focus area. The study area extends along Beach Road to the Tisbury town line, down a portion of Lagoon Pond Road, and it is also bounded by the Beach Street Municipal Parking Lot, Main Street, and the Steamship Authority Ferry Terminal. We'd now like to review our initial flood vulnerability assessment. Based on our review, the existing drainage system at Five Corners is key to any flood mitigation work done at this location, as well as the current flooding that occurs there. Outfall pipes in the study area are located at Beach Street Extension, Lagoon Pond, Main Street, and Beach Road. These pipes form part of the stormwater management system by facilitating drainage off of streets and properties. MassDOT and the town of Tisbury have identified challenges with the existing drainage system that make it difficult to manage stormwater. Low elevation, which is effectively at the current sea level, makes it vulnerable to storm surge. Flooding regularly occurs at Five Corners due to backup at the Beach Street Extension outfall pipe, as well as drainage that slopes toward Five Corners rather than coastal outfall points, which is at Beach Street Extension, Beach Road. The Beach Street Extension outfall pipe also gets blocked up during storm events, which contributes to backflow and more drainage challenges. MassDOT has proposed drainage improvements under our Highway Division project number 609459. That's how we categorize our projects in order to help mitigate stormwater at Five Corners, the current flooding that happens there. As you'll see on the following slides, stormwater challenges are exacerbated by future year flood vulnerability under climate change. We will also note on this slide that the town of Tisbury and other stakeholders have proposed additional flood mitigation measures in the study area and around here. We're very happy to continue dialogue about that, as there are multiple jurisdictions in this area. MassDOT roads, it's also town of Tisbury, it's also private stakeholder property. There's a multitude of jurisdictions here. Part of this study involved looking at future year flood models to understand projected sea level rise and how it may affect the study area. In planning for flood mitigation at Five Corners, it's important to consider how any potential projects could mitigate future flooding, as well as current stormwater issues. This figure on the screen here displays sea level rise projections from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA for short. Displayed sea level rise scenarios project anywhere between 1 and 6 feet. As I sort of referred to before, Five Corners is the lowest point in the study area at 2.5 feet above current sea level. Stormwater flooding on top of existing sea level and future expected sea levels would exacerbate flood depths, as we'll see in coming slides. And we'll also go over this in more detail during our alternatives analysis review. The figure on this slide shows coastal flood exceedance probabilities originating from the Massachusetts Coastal Flood Risk Model. Coastal flood exceedance probability is the likelihood of flooding at a specific location occurring in any given year. The main horizon year we focused on in this study is 2030, and I will elaborate more on that later in this presentation. This data comes from the Massachusetts Office of Coastal Zone Management, CCM, which is the lead policy planning and technical assistance agency on coastal and ocean issues for the Commonwealth. any potential future projects to address flooding in this area would likely require coordination with CZM, as this is a coastal area. Coastal flood exceedance probabilities shown in this figure are between 0.1% and 100%. Most of the study area is projected for 100% flood exceedance in the year 2030, which means more significant flooding at Five Corners than already occurs, expanding across more of the study area, indicating during a storm event, most of the study area will be flooded beyond the area it already floods today. As part of this planning study, we carried out flood modeling in order to review potential horizon years to plan and develop concepts. Per direction, we used the Resilient Mass Action Team model, which is a risk screening tool developed as part of the state's resilience planning initiative, Resilient Mass. RMAT, for short, is a preliminary risk screening tool that outputs results based on categories assigned to assets, such as their critical operation during emergency events. Assets being transportation infrastructure, buildings, and natural resources, to name a few. There are quite a few inputs that you can select. Inputs to this tool for this study resulted in target planning horizons of 2030, 2050, 2070. These are suggested planning years that RMAT suggests we take into account when we're planning for resilience and climate change. Mean high water level, a measure that indicates the highest level water could reach for these years, was a minimum of 3.7 feet for sea level rise in the 2050 year as output by RMAT. And this would be during the highest high tides. It could be a little bit lower than that at times, but it's projected to be at 3.7 feet during the high tides in 2050 year, normal high tides. When it comes to sea level rise, storm surge, RMAT recommended a target planning horizon of 2070 with an intermediate planning year of 2050. Based on the criticality of Five Corners in the Martha's Vineyard transportation network and at a larger level in the neighborhood, town of Tisbury, the community, the output was to plan for a 1,000-year storm return period on the stormwater flooding side of things. Projections for baseline sea level rise, let alone 1,000-year storms in 2050 and 2070, are significant enough that it's challenging to plan for flooding in these years within this planning study scope of work. For 2050 and 2070, the mean high water projections are significantly higher than the existing 2.5 feet elevation above sea level at Five Corners. The projections are that daily, the highest tides can be anticipated to rise above the area's current elevation, which would carry impacts for transportation, drainage, and properties, among others. When we think about the 1,000-year storm in 2050, which is what the RMAT output indicates we should plan for, at least in an intermediate point of view, that's approximately 14 feet of flooding, 14 feet, considering wave action and storm surge, the effects of storms that are going on in the recurring 1,000-year storm. Solutions to address flooding of that magnitude are outside the scope of work of this study. We'll get into that more later. After deliberation with study team members, we determined to use a 2030 horizon year for purposes of study analysis in order to carry this out. We will provide more detail on that later as part of the alternatives analysis slides. At this point, I would like to pass it over to Joe Zisman from our consultant team at Cambridge Systematics to give an overview of the safety analysis, which helped inform subsequent alternatives analysis for roadway improvements in this study. Joe?
Thank you, Patrick. Slide. We analyzed crash data from the period between 2018 and 2022 for the study area. And in that time, one fatal crash occurred during that period. That was a nighttime head-on collision of two vehicles on Beach Road near the Lagoon Pond Bridge. Two injury-causing crashes have occurred at Five Corners, one involving a pedestrian, the other involving a bicyclist. The study area as a whole saw 18 additional injury-causing crashes. The three clear crash clusters, that's a tongue twister, occurred in downtown Vineyard Haven between 2018 and 2022. The first was at Five Corners in the Lagoon Pond Road leg. the second on Water Street northbound at the access point to the ferry terminal, the third on Beach Street where it intersects the Cromwell Lane alleyway and the municipal parking lot. Five Corners is designated a top crash location in Massachusetts, and a road safety audit was carried out at this location, which was a precursor to this study. The study area sees a large volume of pedestrian traffic. The village center and a business hub for those who visit Martha's Vineyard, live there, and work there. It has a ferry terminal with service to Woods Hole, the island's primary post office, a full-service grocery store, and the Black Dog Tavern, in addition to many other small businesses and a small number of residences. Sidewalks and curb ramps are not always sufficient for pedestrians. Some are narrow or are obstructed with poles. Brick sidewalks can be uneven for those with mobility challenges. Crosswalks and the ramps leading to them are not perpendicular to the road and are not clearly marked for accessibility. No pedestrian flashers or other pedestrian signals exist. Street lighting in the area generally is poor. Some of the turns are also too tight for the large trucks and buses accessing Water Street in particular, and we observed those vehicles when we were on site mounting the sidewalk in some cases, which is a dangerous situation for pedestrians. The study area also sees a large volume of bicycle traffic. Not only is this driven by the destinations in the area, but also by the strong commitment from Martha's Vineyard communities to building a robust bicycle network. But a gap in that network exists in the study area. There's a missing link in the island-wide shared use path network between Oak Bluffs and Edgartown through Five Corners. On the basis of this analysis, this study discusses high-level conceptual design alternatives for the study area. The alternatives have two components that mirror the two components of the analysis. The first of those, safety and road treatments, focus on improving multimodal operations and safety. They primarily consist of changes to roadway geometry, signage, and control. The second is adapting to and mitigating the impacts of near-term flooding. While this study analyzed and considered long-term flooding, as Patrick mentioned, more significant analysis will be required as part of any project development. The conceptual design alternatives are presented as short-term, medium, and long-term. They consist of improvements at two locations, the first being Five Corners and also Main Street and Beach Street. And we'll present the alternatives for Five Corners first. The short-term alternative for Five Corners includes rebuilding sidewalks to be ADA compliant, including curbing and curb ramps with tactile strips, realigning crosswalks to be perpendicular with the street, repainting all sidewalks to improve visibility, installing indicator signs for crosswalks, potentially with rapid flashing beacons, repainting stop lines on Lagoon Pond Road, Water Street, and Beach Street Extension, painting new shark's teeth yield lines on approaches without stop signs, and painting a curving yellow line that connects the center lines of Beach Street and Beach Road. All of those are designed to be relatively low cost and implementable relatively quickly. The medium-term alternative for Five Corners includes the low-cost, quick-build measures from the short-term alternative, but makes two substantial changes to roadway geometry. First, Water Street is narrowed from 3 lanes to 2, which allows for the construction of a shared use path for pedestrians and bicyclists. Second, Beach Street Extension is raised and turned into a shared street for cars, pedestrians, and bikes. That's also known as a woonerf, which is a Dutch term. The street would have pavers instead of an asphalt surface and would be accessed via a ramp-like sloping sidewalk from the level of the intersection. This has several benefits. First, it creates a clear physical through line from Beach Street to Beach Road and simplifies the apparent complexity of the intersection from 5 legs to 4. The raised surface also potentially allows for stormwater storage underneath Beach Street Extension and resloping of the outfall at the end toward the end of the street to improve drainage. Access to Beach Street Extension would be maintained for all adjacent homes and businesses under this proposal. It would just appear less like a typical street and more like a driveway. 2 long-term alternatives were also developed for Five Corners: a stop-controlled intersection and a roundabout. The stop-controlled option differs from the prior alternatives by making more substantial changes to roadway geometry and alignment. Specifically, Lagoon Pond Road is curved, so the intersection becomes more perpendicular, resolving the current tight turning radius that brings trucks onto the sidewalk. This alternative also includes a shared use path on the south side of Beach Street and Beach Road, which is accomplished by narrowing Beach Street to 2 formal lanes. This alternative may require additional right-of-way, which would be evaluated during project development. A roundabout option at this location has been discussed in the past and would require substantial additional footprint beyond the current extent of Five Corners. What is shown on the screen is one possible location where a roundabout could be centered, but the center of that roundabout could be moved elsewhere in the general intersection vicinity. Note that the width of the beach road approach at the roundabout prevents the inclusion of the shared use path under this scheme on Beach Road. A single set of improvements was developed for the intersection of Beach Street at Main Street and also State Road, consisting of quick build improvements to sidewalks, ramps, crosswalks, and roadway markings in much the same style as those at Five Corners. A long-term enhancement, which is not drawn, could extend the shared use path from the long-term Five Corners alternatives through this intersection on the south side of Beach Street and potentially onto State Road. Patrick will be taking you through the alternatives analysis, which includes a discussion of infrastructure elevation. Five Corners currently sits at approximately 2.5 feet above mean sea level, and that was mean sea level in 1988. It's also referred to as NAVD 88. This study considered raising the intersection in the long term to either 5 feet above NAVD 88, which is 2.5 feet beyond the current level of the ground, or 5 feet above the current ground level, which is 7.5 feet above NAVD 88.
So thank you, Joe, for taking us through those alternatives. At this point, we'd like to review our alternatives analysis, which is an outline of anticipated roadway impacts, as well as wrapping in potential flood mitigation measures and discussing the effects of the flood projections that we reviewed. In terms of anticipated impacts related to roadway elements, we've split these up amongst the short-term, midterm, and long-term alternatives. When it comes to the short-term alternatives, these are anticipated to result in safety and operations improvements for pedestrians and vehicles at this intersection. They would upgrade Five Corners to current MassDOT standards and create new ADA-compliant pedestrian infrastructure. Short-term alternatives would likely be insufficient to address the current turning radius challenges for large vehicles such as buses and large trucks. The short-term alternatives are conceptualized within existing right-of-way. I'll note on this and the next slide that potential right-of-way impacts are fully evaluated later in the project development process, which would follow this planning study. The midterm alternative for the Five Corners intersection is anticipated to have the same impacts as I listed for short term. The midterm alternative builds off of the short-term alternative with some additional improvements, a shared use path along Water Street, and a potential raised shared street at the Beach Street connection, which would increase comfort and safety and an overall more welcoming environment for pedestrians and bicyclists. The short and midterm alternatives would likely have temporary construction impacts if they advance to project development. These could be access changes in terms of getting to the building or noise related to construction activities. These impacts would be assessed at a more detailed level during project development and presented as part of any design public hearing in project development. Looking at the impacts of long-term alternatives, they would both formalize Five Corners as an intersection, and this is anticipated to have safety benefits. Delineating clear travel path priority would clarify road user right-of-way for vehicles, pedestrians, and bicyclists. The pedestrian improvements would be expected to enhance safety for vulnerable road users. When it comes to the roundabout option, the number of conflict points for vehicles traveling through the intersection would be reduced. So there are also safety improvements anticipated with that alternative. Long-term changes at this location could also address the current turning radius challenges for large vehicles. The long-term alternatives would also likely increase bicycle connectivity by contributing to the island-wide bicycle route with that potential extended shared use path on Beach Street and Beach Road, alongside that potential connection north on Water Street. The full intersection, alternative 1, would be designed so as to accommodate the turning radii of large vehicles, which was noted as a particular concern on the Water Street point at that turn, turning sort of right coming down from Water Street onto Beach Street. This would facilitate travel for large trucks and buses. The roundabout, which we've designated as alternative 2, would be designed to accommodate large turning radii as well. It would likely have right-of-way impacts as the current intersection footprint is somewhat constrained for a roundabout of standard size. For this study, we assumed a 105-foot radius centered on the northwest corner of the Five Corners intersection. The ultimate footprint and associated right-of-way impacts would be assessed in future project development stages. And we would do that in collaboration with affected parties. We also discussed roadway elevation associated with long-term alternatives in order to address current and future flooding. Depending on the height that the road could be elevated to, this would likely have more extended right-of-way impacts, and I will go into that more on following slides. As I mentioned on the last slide, there would likely be the typical temporary impacts associated with construction activities such as noise and access for the long-term alternatives as well. And just to give an overview of potential costs, we've developed high-level summary cost estimates with unit costs based on 2024, 2025 dollars and based on historical MassDOT cost data. For purposes of estimation, the short-term improvements are assumed to be implemented later in 2025 and the midterm in 2027, just for purposes of the cost estimation. Long-term alternatives did not assume a construction year as they are contingent on potentially incorporating flood mitigation measures, such as elevating the roads, and they do include contingency costs, however. These are all estimates and would be subject to change during any potential project development. Going through the list of these numbers, the short-term improvements at Five Corners would possibly be around $322,000. Short-term improvements at Main Street, possibly $201,000. Midterm improvements at Five Corners, perhaps $2.3 million. Long-term roundabout is estimated at $3.8 million. And the long-term formal intersection would be somewhere between $1.8 million and $3.1 million. That somewhat wider range is due to base level changes at Five Corners and potential improvements at Beach Street Extension, turning that into a Wooner shared street. So the lower end of that cost is the formalized intersection, no roundabout. And the higher end is if the sort of midterm Beach Street Extension improvements were incorporated into that as well. Getting into the flooding side of things. We discussed a variety of flood mitigation measures as part of this study. This included a stormwater retention tank, potentially under Beach Street Extension or another location, perhaps as under Five Corners itself, if Five Corners were to be raised. We also discussed potentially elevating state-owned roadways. A stormwater retention tank in this area could provide storage capacity for floodwaters during storm events. The final location for that would need to be determined based on stakeholder consensus, necessary storage capacity, and that would probably involve hydraulic analysis as well. If Five Corners or Beach Street Extension were to be elevated, raised up, a retention tank could be placed under either of those roadways, both of these roadways. Alongside this would probably come the need for a pump system, which would need to be maintained. So that being said, because of the anticipated volumes of floodwaters, the severity of future year flooding that's projected, a stormwater tank might be insufficient and likely would not protect the larger, wider study area from wave action along the harbor line, which also contributes to exacerbated stormwater flooding and higher flood levels. Hydraulic analysis of those effects is outside this study's scope of work. Along with the impacts of flooding itself, it bears worth mentioning there would be temporary impacts from any construction, like noise, access. There might need to be detours. As part of any construction, there are construction-related impacts. There would also likely be right-of-way impacts to abutting properties if any infrastructure were to be elevated. On the side of elevation levels that we considered, which were based on internal discussion and suggestions from the Town of Tisbury Alternatives Analysis Report, which also looked at some other flood mitigation options, those levels were 5 feet and 7.8 feet, 7.5 feet, excuse me, above NAVD 88. That stands for North American Vertical Datum 1988. 88, very wordy, please excuse me. NAVD 88 is the standard benchmark for sea levels that sea level rise is typically measured against. Stormwater flooding in 2030 is projected to be above these proposed levels, above 5 feet, above 7.5 feet above NAVD 88. And stormwater flooding in 2030 would be minimum around 7.8 feet near the shoreline in a 20-year return period. If you don't follow any of this, I'm happy to answer follow-up questions after we get into quite a few numbers in these slides. In about the 1,000-year recurrence planning horizon in 2030, that is possibly near or above 11 feet. When we talk about return periods, these are the benchmarks that indicate how severe flooding will be in a given year based on the occurrence scenario. A 20-year return period indicates the probability that a storm of a certain severity would occur every 20 years, say in 2025, 2030, the probability within that given year. Looking at a 1,000-year return period, these flood depths are anticipated to be more severe, with the RMAT tool we used projecting at least 11.5 feet in that 1,000-year return storm. Considering all of this, these roads would likely need to get elevated above 7.5 feet, the level of which would need to ultimately be determined during project development in coordination with you as local stakeholders, property owners, etc. Naturally, this would have significant impacts. Thinking about the 2030 horizon year with the time it would take to design, engineer, and implement a project, the flood mitigation measures we developed in this study could become obsolete soon after that construction is completed and would likely be insufficient to address additional stormwater flooding and sea level rise in 2050 and 2070. So looking at these impacts, we're going to have some visuals here as well as a bit more explanation. We see a significant amount of flooding projected for 2030. When we think, like I said, when we think about the project development timeline, how long it takes to initiate, design, engineer, and construct a project, that does end up being around 2030, which that scenario we see on the screen here. Any implemented alternatives outlined in the study could become obsolete after that year. With the projections for 2050 and 2070 being more severe than those for 2030, any flood mitigations we've discussed in here in this study likely would not address flooding beyond 2030 either in those future years. On the right, we have several scenarios for 2030, including average tide levels, high tide levels, sea level rise in 2030 under a 20-year storm, and sea level rise under a 100-year storm. As you can see in this figure, both the 20-year storm and the 100-year storm cover a very significant portion of the study area. Under the 20-year storm event, we're looking at projections for a minimum of 7.6 feet at the shoreline per those RMAT outputs that we reviewed. On the next slide, we have a side view of the various 2030 scenarios, just to give a little bit more perspective on this. There are 3 base level elevation points of reference here. That's in the background. At the top, you'll see Main Street, 5 Corners, Vineyard Haven, Oak Bluffs Bridge, Beach Road noted. Main Street is at 23 feet above sea level, 5 Corners, 2.5 feet, and the Beach Road Causeway Bridge area at 12 feet above sea level. These are static points of reference, the current land heights. They're not the water levels. The water levels are below, and I'll walk through those. When it comes to flooding in 2030, we've split up the 20-year and 100-year recurrence storm events. All measures on this slide are relative to NAVD 88, that standard sea level measurement that I referred to earlier. The initial flood reference point in this visual here is the 2024 average mean sea level at the bottom. That's about half a foot above NAVD 88. Above that, we have 2030 average tide elevation at 1.2 feet, the average between high and low tides potentially projected for that year. The 2030 high tide elevation is projected for 2.4 feet. These are base levels without flooding from storms. Looking at that stormwater flooding, which increases the water elevation, the flood depths more, and causes significant waves, for the year recurrence storm event in 2030, this could be anywhere between 7.7 feet at the base level, with waves potentially causing up to 8.8 feet of flooding. When we look at the 100-year storm event in 2030, the anticipated flood heights are higher, with a 9.3 feet base level and 10.4 feet, including waves. And as I'm going to discuss a little bit more, and I previously referred to, those are higher under the 1,000-year storm occurrence. And in the 2050 and 2070 scenarios, those numbers are higher than referred to here, in line with what we referenced before with elevating infrastructure 5 feet or 7.5 feet to protect those roads at 5 corners from stormwater flooding. All of the scenarios that we're talking about on these slides exceed those levels. So today and in general, we're at a point of discussion about how high, I created a little bit of a tongue twister for myself here, how high roads could get raised if they were to be raised. This requires more detailed analysis that would need to come during the project development process. We would want to collaborate with local stakeholders such as the town of Tisbury, Steamship Authority, and other property owners, among others, before advancing road elevation as part of any potential project, since those impacts would likely be significant. So all of that said, we'd like to discuss our proposed next steps after today and recommendations based on the results of this study. And then we'll be able to get into some discussion, questions, feedback about everything that we presented. So this study is being carried out by MassDOT's Office of Transportation Planning in assistance of MassDOT Highway Division. In discussing the results with our counterparts in the Highway Division, the recommendation was to advance project 609459, which would alter part of the drainage system at 5 corners to address current flooding. Work under this project would address challenges with the existing drainage system, current flooding challenges, including pipe slopes and backflow that worsen the current flooding, more significant flood mitigation measures like those that we discussed today, like those that have been proposed otherwise, would need to be discussed with local area stakeholders. Thinking back on the flood projection scenarios that I talked about today, 2030, 2050, 2070. 2030 was our horizon year for the future that we evaluated in this study. As I mentioned, the typical project development process includes design, engineering, and construction, high-level summary. With the time that these steps would take, any potential project at this location would run up around the 2030 horizon year. Thinking of how significant stormwater projections are in 2030, as well as for 2050 and 2070, when there will likely be more severe flooding, we would need to collaborate as a larger group since the affected area extends beyond MassDOT jurisdictions. As we at MassDOT consider advancing a road project in this area, flood mitigation measures could be incorporated, but we do want to achieve consensus with what those are with local stakeholders, with you as a working group in collaboration and discussion. At a minimum, any future potential project brought forward from a roadway perspective should include some sort of additional drainage enhancement to address current flooding and try to address some of that future flooding. If the road at this location were to be elevated, we would need to come to a decision collectively with you as stakeholders about a height that would aim to address or mitigate future flooding, but also minimize impacts to the community. A significant portion of the study area that we evaluated here and beyond the study area lies outside the jurisdiction of MassDOT. We're responsible for the state-owned roads and drainage underneath them. Other elements are outside our jurisdiction. To fully protect this area from flooding, we need to collaborate amongst all stakeholders to achieve effective mitigation measures because of the multiple jurisdictions. And we are happy to continue conversation about that. In terms of what comes next after today, after today, in the future, today was our 3rd working group meeting of the study. In 2 weeks, approximately June 10th, we'll have our 2nd public meeting that evening. It's going to be at 6:30 p.m. Information is on the study website. And we'll give the same presentation to members of the public for their feedback. Following that, we're going to work on organizing input on the alternatives and analyses from today's meeting, from the public meeting, any comments that we receive outside the meetings, to finalize study recommendations and organize for what comes next. Looking ahead, MassDOT will continue to coordinate with local partners on next steps. At this point, we would like to open up the floor to discussion to you as working group members. If there are any members of the public attending today, know that you'll be able to speak after. For working group members, just to go in an organized fashion, click the raise hand button at the bottom of your screen, and I'll recognize you, call on you. We can have a back and forth in order to be recognized. If you don't want to speak, or if you'd like to just pop something written in, you can submit questions and comments in the question and answer box at the bottom of your screen. Just click on that question, Q&A, question mark box at the bottom of the screen. And just a reminder right now that this meeting is being recorded and it will be posted on the study website with comments subject to disclosure for public record. And as you speak, just so we're all familiar, please state your name and identify your affiliation. Ben, you have a raised hand. Thanks for being here today.
First, can you send us the slide deck so that we can
Yes.
reference it? Thanks.
Yes,
And then-
it'll be posted online in the coming days. I have to do some accessibility with Adobe Acrobat so that I can post on the website, but it'll be posted and I can send you an email once it's posted.
Okay. And can you flip back to the midterm slide?
Yes, the roadway.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, this one here. So you guys are considering losing the turning lane on Water Street for the right-hand turn, which allows any traffic that's going up Island to make that turn and head up Beach Street instead of the cars that are trying to turn across traffic to get to Oak Bluffs. I think that might be problematic, especially at the times when the Steamship Authority is offloading vessels and there is, call it a 50-50 split. There is an alternative route up Union Street to get up Island, but most of the traffic does flow out to Five Corners and wants to make that right-hand turn. And if they're queued behind a car that needs to make the left-hand turn across traffic, it's gonna lead to more blockage on Water Street. So I'm not sure if that makes sense. So that's just one sort of question.
Thank you.
Globally, 2030 is right around the corner, and as a planning horizon for improvements, I think we're going to have to think a little bit beyond that. Advancing the current 609459 project, part of that project was utilizing town property at the old fire station lot for a retention area. There were problems that were identified by the state with that property. What does that look like for advancing given those issues? Is that the same as we understand it to be today?
Do you want me to speak to that, Pat, or?
Yeah, that would be great. Rich Bilski, District 5. Thank you.
Yeah, Ben, it's still the same issues that we're dealing with. Is we'd have to have that site investigated and determine if there is actual contamination that was potentially identified there before we could proceed with utilizing that site. And then the same issue would still hold true with respect to the outlet on Beach Road extension. Would come to some kind of consensus on extending the outlet pipe.
Right. And then the Woodruff Street, Beach Street, there's a fair amount of parking that's public parking on that street. How would that interact with that type of street design?
Could you repeat that? Where is that, Ben?
The raised Beach Street extension, what you guys are calling the Woodruff shared street. How do you incorporate parking within that system?
You could still have parking on there. It depends on how you want it to behave. I've seen them used in different ways. They could still be open for deliveries. and parking of the adjacent buildings, it just wouldn't be it behave more of as a pedestrian plaza, I think is a good way to state it. Would you agree, Joe?
Yeah, so I think I agree with Richard that they have been utilized in many different ways for a lot of different uses. One thing that I would say is that the main feature of raising the road to the curb line is to simplify visually the perceived complexity of the Five Corners intersection. So, the degree to which this is the perfect WUNRF, I'm not necessarily sure that it would be, but the goal here is to actually just get that elevation raised up. So you could still have parking raised raised to the curb line.
Yeah, I mean, the current Beach Street extension, raised or not, sort of acts like that already. It's not a through road, so it's slow moving traffic. There's bikes and pedestrians in the roadway, and it seems to work that way anyway. So I think raising it to differentiate it from Five Corners, sort of making it Four Corners instead of Five Corners, there's something there. I wonder how much gain we get. Again, this is more drainage retention, but it would be on town property in the town right roadway. But how successful would that retention area be given the flooding horizons you guys were outlining?
Well, a couple of things, Ben, that you could use it by raising it. It would allow the town to use it for other purposes too, such as, let's say, vendor trucks or activities or other functions. You could maybe adjust the parking so it was more longer duration, so you didn't have people going in and out at regular intervals. So there's different ways of looking at what the town could do with it. By raising it, it gives us the possibility of also putting storage under the roadway too. So that could help us mitigate times when there was a storm event and let's say the flapper was closed. So we could have like surge capacity under there.
Right, but if you don't raise Five Corners drainage, you can't really raise the retention above that. So that's where the coordination between a raised road next to it, you're not, unless you're going to have the pump system that you guys have talked about.
Personally, I think we would probably do it hand in hand, and as Pat was saying, is it all depends on to what degree we think is achievable and is reasonable. So maybe there's something like a smaller number that could be achieved. So the Five Corners was raised in relations to the the Beach Street extension. I don't know what that number is. As we would develop a design, we could determine what that is, the ideal spot. Somewhere between 0 and what would be acceptable without being overly invasive on adjacent properties.
One past planning exercise the town did in 2022, and we were looking at Water Street, Lagoon Pond Road, NAVD, raising it to 6 NAVD as a target elevation. And in some places that's 18 inches, in some places it's 2 feet, but it's a significant. I mean, that was sort of like the planning target at that point to build some resilience to flooding.
Right.
And you could do that just based on the projections that we reviewed in this study. If we think about it in terms of opportunity cost, you can do that, and that would help in the nearer term. But looking out at 2050, 2070, if you're not going to end up in this same place with more flooding on top of that 5 feet, 6 foot elevation, you would need to elevate it higher to a point where there would be more substantial impacts.
Yeah, and
Joe,
I guess that. Well, just my last point is that until we sort of investigate those longer term solutions, we're talking about paint, we're talking about some sort of sidewalk improvements, and we really haven't considered what the long term solution is. And I was wondering what's MassDOT's recommendation to both the state and the island towards that solution.
I think as far as that goes, Ben, it's more as we come up with a recommendation as a group, because once we leave, as Pat said, once you leave the roadway, it's outside our jurisdiction. is when you start raising the road higher and higher, now you're eliminating access to adjacent abutters. So how do they access the road if the road's 2 feet or more higher? So what does that do to their property?
Yeah, so I guess the question is, as Tisbury looks at this area and we put forward potential solutions that will impact how the road is laid out, what is MassDOT's role and responsibility in that? I mean, we'd hope that you guys are a partner in thinking through some of those options as we look at a longer term planning horizons.
Right. I mean, definitely we're a partner, but a lot of this is you're talking about zoning and other bigger issues which are outside our previous purview.
To jump in, and then Joe, I don't know if you had something that you wanted to say about all of this, or if you had a separate point. But I think one of the reasons that we're here today to talk about this is because it's not a decision that MassDOT can come to on our own. We have our recommendations, we have everything that we've evaluated, but because in order to address those future year flood impacts, because that's beyond the roads itself and the drainage that's under our jurisdiction, that's not a decision that we can make individually because there are so many other jurisdictions in this area. There's other stakeholders. Like this isn't just us. This is a communal discussion that we have to have in order to talk about and come up with that overall flood protection strategy. Joe, did you want to go ahead? I think you're on mute.
Yeah, Ben, you bring up great points, and some of these we discussed yesterday with Patrick and Richard. I had a preliminary conversation, one to show or to express Tisbury's support in these projects and concerns along the way. But one of the sites that we own is the former firehouse area, and I think we, as a township, have to move forward in finding funding, whether it be state or federal, to really look at how bad that site is, because I think it becomes a pivotal site that could be used in the future with it, for any upstream water, for some of this. But again, you bring up great points. I think they were all talking points we had yesterday as well. But I think Mass DOT, set it together. It's going to take all the stakeholders to be involved with this as we go forward, and our commitment from the town is certainly there, and it has been expressed.
Thanks, Joe. And you made me think of something that, Ben, you alluded to this as well, that I'd just like to briefly speak to. When we talk about our drainage project, 609459 at MassDOT, flooding is a consistent problem at Five Corners now. It's been going on for years. It continues to go on as sea levels rise and as storms get more severe and more frequent. The flooding is going to get worse. On our side at MassDOT, in terms of a near-term recommendation to address that current flooding in, something that's already tiered up and somewhat ready to go quicker than any long-term solution that, as a larger group, MassDOT, Tisbury, other stakeholders, we still need to talk about. That drainage project is tiered up to try and address that current flooding to the extent that it can. James, it looked like you wanted to jump in. Thanks for being here.
Sorry, I can't find my hand for some reason, but
that's okay.
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity. I think we're very much, I say we, but I think there's probably an interest in other parties that aren't here too, to continue this dialogue and this partnership, because I mean, we kind of started this with Region 5 in 2017. We had designs on the fire station location. One of the things that culminated in a report in 2019 with the recommendations that were moved forward. And then subsequently, I think, one of the things that makes the fire station retention so effective is a discharge point to Mud Creek. That when that's eliminated, which it was due to a permitting, and maybe this is where we really need more of a partnership between the town and DOT. When that's eliminated, it's doing very little because everything's still hydraulically jamming up five corners. So it'd be great to find ways to coordinate where the town maybe can do partial disconnection that would then marry into a DOT project. And I think the same exists for anything that happens on the Beach Street extension. I kind of think of it like as a former EMT, it's like that our patient here, which is the flooding issue and the health and safety issue has airway problems, has bleeding problems, and it's great to anticipate the future cancer it might have with respect to 2030 flooding, but the immediate problem I think is really unavoidable, and that's the flooding that occurs even with as little as a half an inch of rain there that jams up the primary way to the hospital and the primary exit route off the island. So I think, I can't speak for Joe, but I know there are plans, and there's kind of I think a burning desire to do something more immediately that could fit into a larger project, but would have to be coordinated in a way such that the pieces kind of fit together as the short-term mitigation efforts merge into the midterm, long-term. So thank you.
Thank you,
And
James.
I guess my question there is how do we do that more partnership coordination where maybe the town takes a piece, but it has to coordinate with DOT short, mid, and long-term plans.
From a project development perspective, that's probably something that Rich or Hung can speak to better. Hung, I noticed you went off mute. I don't know if there was something that you were planning on adding in here, but either Hung or Rich, if you want to take that.
Hey, I can take on the question of the modification of what UNH and EPA proposed back in 2019. I can't believe it's been so long already. How are you, Jim? It's been a while. And the decision of removing that piece of draining through the park and ultimately creek is that there'll be a conversion of an open space that would take on more time frame, because at this point we're not sure whether or not the park has protection under Article 97, and right now the process of the Article 97 conversion takes a lot longer than normal. So I believe this blends into your discussion of like how would this play into the long, short, middle, and long term. The fact is, potentially we open up the discussion on the drainage issue again and working out with the town on how to mitigate or evaluate the soil underneath the fire station, and then having that open up the discussion again with the harbor master on how far out the outfall could be. Because if we leave the outfall where the concept proposed, our thinking is if the storm surge comes in, sediment build up against it, that it's practically ineffective, and we're back to square one. So I believe that we have doing it long enough in the discussion to we open dialogue again on those concepts and ideas.
And I would add on to say that this is something that we want to keep talking about, and I don't want to say talking about it because we don't want to talk in circles. We want to find a solution that works for both MassDOT, where we are involved in what's feasible, and then where that overlap is with town property or other stakeholders as well. There is a medium that needs to be found to advance any solution here. Ben, you have a raised hand, and also Rich. I'm not sure if Rich, you wanted to jump in either before or after that.
I'll let Ben go first, but I was going to say something.
Yeah, I was just going to add, something that we've talked about in the past that I don't think was evaluated in this yet is, could we divert some of the flow into the Union Street system, because that one doesn't suffer from the same sedimentation issue that Five Corners. So was that investigated?
I can answer to that. I did. GPI, that time, I asked them to do a quick evaluation on how it would look like. Union Street is outside of Mass DOT's jurisdiction, in this town. And we looked at what is the elevational change that we need to have in order for the stormwater to go by. The trench digging on Union Street would be approximately 10 to 15 feet as a whole, just to get enough grading, for lack of a better word, just to get to where we wanted to go. So that is in and of itself an expensive endeavor, and really a reconstruction of the whole corridor on town's jurisdiction. And is this where, and after I see that, I jumped to a conclusion that the town may not want to do it and never actually want to pursue that any further because of how expensive it would be for the town.
When you're talking, I was imagining that we're talking about at the end of Main Street connecting into the system as it comes down State Road, not actually Union Street.
The Union Street comes up in terms of elevation a little bit before it drops back down, and so to bringing that whole elevation will change.
You're talking about Main Street, not Union Street, I think.
Rich, I think we're running into your internet issues, unfortunately.
Oh, I thought it was me.
You might want to turn off your camera.
Yeah, but to your point, Ben, is that we need to connect. We need to go from
I'm trying to
Union Street in order to connect that system. We can't go from, but there's no there's really no diversion.
You can connect it where it comes down Spring Street. You know, there's a gap, and there is a little rise in Main Street. You know, it's really that connection, and whether the pitch there when you meet up with the Union Street system. I assume that you've done that, but it's just the way you were describing. I didn't see any trenching needs on Union Street. It was really Main Street to make that connection.
Yeah,
it's not just
connection to Union Street.
Could you put that page 3 up that shows the existing drainage system so we can all?
Yeah, I'm happy
I'm
to.
not really. Yeah, so everybody can understand where this connection point is.
This one, yeah.
Yeah, so if you look at the
Yeah.
gap between the yellow and the green on Main Street, if you were to take the load coming down State Road at Main Street and branch over, you could dump out into the Union Street system from the State Road system, yellow to the green. You
Okay.
can see there's a
And
gap
we were
there.
saying, Hun, there's a big rise in, and we had to do a really deep cut to get through there. That is what you're saying.
I think the small gap between the yellow and the teal or green is Main Street.
Yes, that's Main Street. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
I'm gonna just step in to do a clarifying question to make sure that we're all on the same page. And I'm gonna use my hands hopefully as an okay demonstration here. Hung, it sounds like what you're saying is that because Union Street, there is that gradient there, you'd have to raise all of that and maybe end up raising Five Corners as well. And we're back to talking about those larger right-of-way impacts and as well as this being outside of our jurisdiction.
No, Union Street is on. Let me clarify. The connection road between Beach Street and Union Street is Main Street. So there is that gap between that little small gap from the yellow to the teal or green. That is Main Street. So in order to connect to that system, we need to trench on Main Street to connect it, and the trench is very, very deep.
But that wouldn't necessarily address the low level and the drainage at the Five Corners intersection.
That would divert I would just say a percentage. Don't know what the percentage is.
Yeah, it would be the percentage of water that's at that higher level, but not the water that's down by Five Corners. It would prevent runoff, but it wouldn't address all of it.
Yep. So at this point, we're just basically diverting water that's coming from the upper elevation down to the Five Corner.
Right. And then hung along that, I think we should let everybody know too that we were already modifying the drainage at Causeway Street, so we were going to break the systems. So only that upper segment of State Road was going to continue down to Five Corners.
So the trench, so we would be diverting everything to Causeway from the upper elevation. That little small segment from Causeway to Main Street will go into Main Street. So now you're digging a trench for that little small segment.
Exactly. It's only a very small segment. It's not everything up there. Yeah.
Well, it does pick up Camp Street. Anyway, I'm glad you guys looked at it. It was an option.
Yeah, definitely. When as soon as you said that, I went to the drawing board. I was like, what does this really mean, and how do we actually do that? Because I thought it was a great idea, and then once we did some engineering work and really evaluated, it was a very costly endeavor.
Robert Davis, you unmuted. It looks like you want to speak.
Yeah.
Thank you for being here.
Can't find my raise the hand icon.
That's okay. Yeah.
So, the question, getting back to that Union Street, with the Beach Street extension you were talking about, under the street, retention, water retention, but the Union Street, would that be an outfall? Because if it is, and there's a mention of sedimentation, it being that close to our slips could be problematic if it's an outfall. So
That outfall exists, Robert.
yeah, but I mean, if you're adding more to it,
okay.
that would have to be a consideration that has to be taken.
So thank you. In terms of the larger scope of things here, other things that we reviewed today, is there additional feedback anyone would like to share, clarifying questions? I know we have other working group members on the call as well. Ben, do you want to go ahead? And then for anyone else, if you're not comfortable speaking verbally, you are also welcome to put things in the question and answer box at the bottom, and I can read them out loud. Go ahead, Ben. Thanks.
I just wanted to get a little more on the, sort of bike circulation
Yeah.
for this intersection. Sort of, you talked about some of the intersection improvements, but how does that marry into broader bike circulation? Because we recently had a MassDOT project that put road sort of lanes, bike lanes in the road, but not a shared use path. Did that satisfy MassDOT for getting bikes from Oak Bluffs at least to Five Corners?
Well, Ben, originally there was going to be a shared use path as part of that project.
I know. I mean, I wish there was a shared use path, but I'm talking about what we ended up with.
Well, I don't know, Rich, do you want to speak to it first?
I mean, we'll do, for reasons outside MassDOT's control, we weren't able to install the shared use path as part of the Beach Road project. So basically we have on-road facilities right now, and I don't see any way that can be addressed at this time on the Beach Road section that was already reconstructed. As far as the Water Street, though, I think that depends on further study than what we end up doing there, versus if it's a short term or long term, and how much room we have to work with.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the question was about, because now you have a bike lane on either side of the road. That means the intersection has to be treated differently than if it was a shared use path.
Yes, yes.
And is there? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. It's complicated.
And that might be tied in. We might have another opportunity in the future, depending on what we want to do with Beach Road itself. With what year we pick and what kind of impacts we're willing to have down the road. But I mean, that's more of a long. I think at this point that's more of a long term.
Yeah,
issue.
and I understand that this this study is fairly focused. And we talked about, communal conversation, multiple stakeholders. One thing that I think the private property owners need the most is predictability. So if they're planning a project that they're like, is this viable for 10 years, 20 years, 30 years? What is the road potentially going to look like looking out that far? I know this is an incredibly hard thing to visualize or to even, anticipate, but to bring the stakeholders together, the property owners, there's going to need to be a level of predictability that we can say, okay, in 20 years, this is really what we're going to have to be doing, or at least these are the things we're going to have to approach. So I do sort of challenge and cajole the MassDOT to sort of, be a convener of that conversation as much as a participant. I think your guidance, you are the road system in there, everything sort of starts and stops with the mass highway. So I'd hope that we can figure out how we're going to have that bigger conversation beyond just, some of these short-term improvements. Thanks.
I think that's a good point, Ben. And as part of any project development, there would be continued meetings that say, here's what we're doing, we're coming out, this is what's proposed, so that you're aware of it in advance. And any, like we said earlier, any right-of-way impacts would be evaluated. I think to your other point, the conversation doesn't necessarily end with today's working group meeting or the public meeting or after this study, because I don't want to talk about continuing to meet, but I think, Joe, as we talked about yesterday, we'd like this to continue to be an open dialogue about collaborating on solutions in this area. And then there's the road, and there's Ben, as you say, predictability of what will happen to the road. That's something that, we're still working on figuring out. We're deciding what's going to move forward based on your feedback, and how things shake out from a MassDOT project development perspective. On the other side of this, though, and part of the reason why we're here today is the flooding, and there are projections for future flooding, which, thinking back to those maps that have those scenarios, I just will pull up one pretty quick. In terms of what we're talking about right now, obviously at this time, the decision has not been made to put anything forward into the project development process, because that's not the point that we're at. But on the other side of the roadway things, we have these projected flood impacts that are expected to get worse. And at least what you refer to on the property owner side of things, this is also a consideration. We can certainly keep talking, but just in mind of people's time and in recognition that there might be members of the public on the call today, I would open up the larger floor at this point to questions or comments from everybody on this meeting. If you are joining as an attendee, you are welcome to submit comments in the question and answer box at the bottom of the screen. You can also click the raised hand button at the bottom of the screen, or if you're on a phone, you just do *9 on the dial pad, and that will raise a virtual hand. We can call out the last 4 digits of your phone number to recognize you. Across the board, again, if you state your name and affiliation, that helps us recognize each other, know who's here at the table today. And for our general procedures, we ask you share one question or comment at a time, just to allow everybody to speak. So if there are any members of the public who would like to put anything in the question and answer box, we certainly would also welcome any working group members who haven't spoken today. You're welcome to jump in. Also happy to speak after today's meeting. The question and answer box is at the bottom of your screen. I will just touch base on feedback after today's meeting. If anyone would like to mail in feedback, this is our address here. It's the Office of Transportation Planning, MassDOT, 10 Park Plaza, Suite 4150, Boston, Massachusetts, 02116. And if you can just write on the envelope, address label, attention, multimodal planning, that's the team carrying out the study, so that'll help our little mailbox setup that we have here. You can also email comments to planning@dot.state.ma.us. And if you want to follow more updates throughout the study or review documents from previous meetings, today's recording and meeting slides will be posted on the study website. that's here, mass.gov, Martha's Vineyard Beach Road Study, dashes between Martha's Vineyard, etc. Or if you have a phone handy, we have this QR code here too. So again, we would welcome anybody who hasn't spoken to speak or write things in the question and answer box. If there's anyone who wants to speak again or make any final points as well, you're welcome to. With all of that said, again, I would invite you to submit feedback after today's meeting through any of these avenues. I will close with a reminder about the public meeting that's coming up in about a week and a half, Tuesday, June 10th. It's at 6:30 p.m. It'll also be on Zoom. That's a wider public meeting. Everybody is welcome to attend. Please tell people about it. And we will accept feedback between now and then after the meeting, and we will continue to coordinate on next steps. And I'd like to make it clear that we're happy to keep talking. So, Robert, you unmuted. Did you want to jump in before we close?
I just wanted to thank everyone for their time and the efforts that this project. It's important for
Yeah.
importance for the island, for that intersection. So
thank you. And for everyone's benefit, just to confirm, you're joining from the Steamship Authority today, correct?
Correct.
Thank you. Thank you everyone for being here, especially Tisbury Steamship Authority, elected officials and staff, my MassDOT colleagues, everybody, thank you. We'll have that public meeting in about a week and a half, and I wish you all a good afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you.